So it's September 11th, and of course the internet is loaded with, and television is loaded with memorials and you know, and all of that, and that, you know, never forget, right? But for a lot of us who come from there, you know what I mean, who were like part of that, and then that was our reality, you know, we don't need to be reminded. It's like, you know, enough, just let it go, right? So what I like to do, you know, when it comes to stuff like this is remember the better things that were part of New York, you know, in the day. Like, for instance, you guys often see me wear this shirt, this Manhattan Speed shirt. So Manhattan Speed was on, it was 232 West Broadway. And it was literally like in the shadow of the Trade Center. I remember the first time that I went there, I was about 12, 13 years old. So I was in like junior high school. And I heard that they had a camera there. So we lived on Staten Island. So I remember taking the ferry across and walking through the Trade Center, you know, complex to get to West Broadway, and then walking up the street. And then, yeah, they had a camera there. You know, it was great. You know, I actually got to see, you know, my first, like, right. So anyway, New York was a really, really special place. By the way, if you guys hear chirping in the background, it's because we have chickens. We just went and bought five chickens to run around in the backyard because, you know, you need chickens, right? That's what us Tennesseans do. So ignore the chirping. So Manhattan Speed, it was part of an era that people, you can't really explain to people unless they were there. Kind of like September 11th. Like, you can't explain to people what the whole thing was like unless you were there. Well, you can't explain New York street racing in the 70s, the 60s, the 70s, and into the 80s unless you were actually there. People will be like, you know, so hot rodding was born in Los Angeles, and they created an art form out of it, and there was a lot of stuff going on in the era. And of course, Detroit was, you know, off the chain with street racing, right? Chicago, lots of places had very active scenes in the 60s and the 70s. But New York City was different. You know, New York City had a much higher, much more dense population. We had almost 8 million people in 1970. Los Angeles had like less than 3 million. I think Chicago had like 1.5 million or 2 million, same thing with Detroit. So it was a population density thing. And then there was also a geographic lock. Like, for instance, if you were in Los Angeles and you wanted to go street race, you know, you could just run 20 miles out the road, 10, 15 miles out the road, and find, you know, plenty of places. Just go ahead and do your thing. And in New York City, you didn't have that. You had like a geographic lock. So you were surrounded by this dense metropolitan area that, well, if you were going to race, you had to do it then and there, you know, in the street. Like I said, it's hard to imagine what it was like. If you go back to like the 1970s, on any given night in the 5 boroughs, there was probably a good 1,000 cars out there. And all ready to race. You know, we didn't do much cruising in New York City. You know, it's cruise nights, what you guys call cruise nights tonight, you know, these days, where everybody gathers in a parking lot in the app. Well, that's what we used to do in New York. We didn't really roll around. We gathered in parking lots, argued, bickered, did everything else, and then we went out and we raced. It was all about going out and racing. Stoplight to stoplight, after midnight. It was, New York City in the 70s was an anarchist's playground. It was just really anything went. The cops were there were laws, but nobody really cared, nobody paid any attention. After midnight or so, every stoplight was a drag strip. And if you didn't feel like going stoplight to stoplight with people, you go to places like the Connecting Highway. This is like the legendary New York City spot. This lasted up until the late 1970s. Flyers like this were common. There would be places where people would hang out, drive-ins and whatnot, and these flyers would get hung out. On a busy night, you'd have 2,000-3,000 people spectating, 300-400 cars lined up, ready to run. There was more traffic at the Connecting Highway than there was at the typical drag strip. This is a sticker that a lot of people had. The dragster on it, it's not just for illustration purposes. Red Lang occasionally would take the Dead End Kids Top Fueler and make runs over there. You know, full runs, quarter mile, bridge to bridge, with the you know, the chutes out at the end and the whole bit. Nunzi Romano used to run an altered wheelbase Pontiac on nitro there every once in a while. It was a full-on drag strip. There were so many other places. You know, there was Fountain Avenue and West Shore Expressway started on the South Avenue. The imports got started. There was Dominican and Puerto Rican guys were racing imports in the middle '70s in places like Red Hook, and all of this is happening in a tiny condensed little area. There was actually, believe it or not, there was a Haitian. I got to be friends with a guy who was a government Haitian Formula One driver that was exiled for one thing or another, and he found himself in New York City, and he was making his living street racing imports, compact cars, in like the late '70s. You had magazines like this. You know, all of the quality magazines were coming from the West Coast. You know, you had Hot Rod, Carcraft, Popular Hot Rodding. You know, it was a state of the art. And these magazines, and these were like my magazine ancestors, because I didn't start doing them until the '80s. This is a 1970 issue, and these were like New York City newsletters. You know, all of the stories and whatnot were from the New York City. In this particular issue, there's 31 advertisements for local speed shops. Again, this is within the city limits, you know, within the metropolitan area. This isn't like, you know, spread over New York. This is just a little tiny area. And those are just the ones that chose to advertise in this magazine. At one time, there were probably 75 to 100 active speed shops, you know, operating within the metropolitan New York City area. It was just an amazing time. There was even a chassis shop. There was a guy who ran a chassis shop. And this was they had the riots in the Bronx. I guess it was like '67, '68, and they burned out like huge, you know, the apartments. They just burned out huge areas. And there was a guy who set up a chassis shop, a race car chassis shop, in one of these burned out buildings, or these apartment buildings out there. And you know, talk about surreal. He would start business at like, he'd open the shop at like 8, 9 o'clock at night. When you wanted to visit him, you know, get something done, you were there at 2, 3 in the morning, and you'd be sitting there and he'd be welding, and you'd be, you know, talking and hanging out, and there'd be gunshots and sirens and all kinds of other stuff. It was crazy. New York City was crazy. That's probably why I'm so much out of step with like pretty much everybody else, you know, that's in this thing. You know, 'cause that's my background. That's how I grew up. That's my childhood. So I see things a little bit differently. But anyway, you know, it was an amazing place. It was an amazing time. Whenever we do a live, we do lives every Sunday night. I always get people like, "Oh, tell street racing stories. Tell us about your, you know, street racing days." And it's like, I can't. It's like okay, so tell me a story about the time you ate dinner, or tell me a story about the time you put socks on, because that's how frequently we raced. That was, you know, if you added up the number of street racing passes I've made versus the number of meals dinners I've eaten, I've probably made more runs than eating meals. 50, 60 a night, you know. It was just a normal thing. So, yeah, September 11th, you know, and, you know, I prefer to not think about that stuff, and this is what I want to remember. So, I'll see you tomorrow.